The old sailor's weathered hands trembled as he held the mysterious map, its edges yellowed with age and secrets. In the dim candlelight of a Geno's tavern on that fateful night, in 1491, Christopher Columbus studied the ancient parchment that would soon reshape the entire world. Little did the patrons around him know that they were witnessing the birth of an idea that would forever alter the course of human history. Christopher Columbus, born Cristoforo Colombo in the Republic of Genoa around 1451, possessed an unshakable belief that would either make him the greatest explorer of his age or destroy him entirely. The son of a wool weaver, Columbus had spent his youth absorbing tales of distant lands and studying the works of ancient geographers like Ptolemy and Marco Polo. By 1477, Columbus had already survived a shipwreck off the coast of Portugal, swimming to shore with nothing but his burning ambition. It was during his time in Lisbon that he began formulating his revolutionary theory. The earth was smaller than most scholars believed, and the westward route to the Indies would be shorter and more profitable than the dangerous eastern passages controlled by Ottoman forces. The young navigator spent years poring over maps in monastery libraries, calculating distances, and studying wind patterns. His brother Bartholomew, a skilled cartographer, helped him refine his calculations. Together, they believed that Japan lay merely 2,400 miles west of the Canary Islands, a catastrophic miscalculation that would ironically lead to one of history's most significant discoveries. Columbus first approached King John II of Portugal in 1484 with his ambitious proposal. The Portuguese court, already committed to finding an eastern route around Africa, rejected his plan as too costly and impractical. Undeterred, Columbus turned to the Spanish court, where he would spend nearly 8 years trying to convince Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon to fund his expedition. The Spanish monarchs were initially skeptical. Their advisors, including the learned men of the University of Salamanca, ridiculed Columbus's calculations and deemed his voyage impossible. But Columbus possessed an almost supernatural persistence, returning again and again to the royal court, refining his arguments and gradually winning supporters among the Spanish nobility. According to historical accounts documented by Washington Irving in his 1828 biography of Columbus, the explorer's fortunes changed dramatically after the fall of Granada. In January 1492, with the Reconquista finally complete and the last Muslim stronghold in Spain conquered, the Catholic monarchs found themselves with surplus resources and a desire to spread Christianity to new lands. The pivotal moment came when Columbus, having been rejected once more, was already riding away from the Spanish court. Queen Isabella, moved by the arguments of Luis de Santangle, the royal treasurer, sent a messenger to recall the determined navigator. On April 17, 1492, Columbus signed the capitulations of Santa Fe, granting him the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any lands he might discover, along with 10% of any wealth found. As Columbus prepared for his journey, gathering supplies and recruiting crew members in the port of Palos, few could have imagined that his miscalculations would lead not to the Indies, but to the discovery of two entire continents that would forever change the balance of world power. The pre-dawn darkness of August 3, 1492, was broken only by the flickering torches illuminating the harbor of Palos de la Frontera. Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, his flagship, watching as his crew of 90 men made final preparations for what many believed would be their final voyage. Beside him, the Niga and the Pinta bobbed gently in the Atlantic swells, their captains Martin Alonso Pinzon and Vicente Alves Pinzon ready to follow their admiral into the vast unknown. The first leg of the journey took them to the Canary Islands, where they spent for weeks making repairs and taking on fresh supplies. It was here that Columbus made a crucial decision that would affect all future navigation. He began keeping the logbooks, one showing the actual distance traveled and a false one showing shorter distances to prevent his crew from panicking about how far they had traveled from home. On September 6, 1492, the three ships finally departed the Canaries and headed due west into waters no European had ever navigated. Columbus had calculated that Japan should appear after sailing approximately 2,400 miles westward. But as the days stretched into weeks, doubt began to creep into the minds of his sailors. The voyage tested every man aboard those vessels. Strange phenomena troubled the crew. the compass needle began pointing northwest instead of north. As they traveled farther from Europe, seaweed appeared in massive floating patches unlike anything they had seen and unfamiliar. Birds flew overhead. Columbus, drawing upon his experience as a navigator, explained these mysteries to his increasingly anxious men, telling them the compass variation was natural and the birds were signs of nearby land. By early October, the situation had become desperate. The crew of the Santa Maria had begun plotting mutiny, demanding that Columbus turn back before they all perished in the endless ocean. The Pinzon brothers, experienced sailors themselves, supported Columbus but privately worried about their dwindling supplies and the growing unrest among their men. This account draws from Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive study Admiral of the Ocean Sea, which utilized primary Spanish archives. On October 10, 1492, Columbus promised his crew that if they did not sight land within 3 days, he would turn back towards Spain. It was a desperate gambit by a man who had staked everything on his calculations. That very night, however, the signs of land became unmistakable. Carved sticks floated past their ships. Fresh vegetation appeared in the water, and land birds flew overhead in increasing numbers. At 2 o'clock in the morning on October 12, 1492, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, spotted a white cliff shining in the moonlight. His cry of "Tierra, tierra," land, land, echoed across the water, awakening every soul in the small fleet. Columbus, who had barely slept in days, rushed to the deck and confirmed the sighting. After 36 days at sea, covering approximately 3,000 miles, they had reached what Columbus believed were the outer islands of the Indies. As dawn broke over the island the natives called Guanahani, Columbus and his men prepared to go ashore. The admiral donned his finest clothes and carried the royal banner of Castile and Lean. When his boat touched the sandy beach, Columbus knelt and kissed the ground, claiming the land for their Catholic majesties and naming it San Salvador. The encounter with the indigenous Taino people marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history. Columbus described them in his journal as very well-formed people, with handsome bodies and very fine faces. The natives, led by their cacique, approached the strange visitors with curiosity rather than fear, offering gifts of parrots, cotton, thread, and small gold ornaments that immediately caught the Europeans' attention. The moment Christopher Columbus set foot on the pristine shores of San Salvador, two worlds that had existed in complete isolation for thousands of years suddenly collided. The Taino people, who gathered on the beach that morning in October 1492, could never have imagined that these strange, pale visitors would herald the end of their ancient way of life. Columbus immediately noticed the small gold ornaments worn by some of the natives, and his excitement was palpable. Through gestures and broken communication, he learned that the gold came from the south and west. This discovery convinced him that he had indeed reached the outer islands of the Indies, and that the legendary wealth of Chipang, New Japan lay just beyond the horizon. Over the following days, Columbus explored several islands in what would later be called the Bahamas. He captured 6 Taino people to serve as guides and interpreters, a decision that would establish a tragic pattern for European indigenous relations. These captives, whom Columbus described as very intelligent, were forced to help him navigate the island chains, while he searched desperately for the gold mines and spice markets he expected to find. The expedition next reached Cuba on October 28, 1492. Columbus believed this large island might be the mainland of China, and he sent scouts inland to search for the great Khan cities described by Marco Polo. Instead, his men encountered vast tobacco plantations and learned of a custom completely unknown to Europeans. The natives rolled dried leaves into tubes and smoked them, inhaling the aromatic fumes. Frustration mounted as Columbus realized that these islands did not match the wealthy civilizations described in his ancient sources. The natives lived in simple thatched huts, possessed no written language, and their gold consisted of small ornaments and decorative items rather than the vast treasures he had promised his royal sponsors. The situation became more complicated when Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta, decided to break away from the expedition in late November to search for gold independently. This left Columbus with only 2 ships as he continued eastward. Reaching the island he named Hispaniola on December 5, 1492. Hispaniola proved to be the most significant discovery of the first voyage. The island was larger and more populated than the previous landfalls, and its Taino inhabitants possessed more gold ornaments than Columbus had seen elsewhere. The cacique Guacanagari welcomed the Europeans warmly, and Columbus began to believe he had finally found a suitable location for establishing a permanent settlement. Contemporary accounts of these encounters are preserved in Bartolomé de las Casas' Historia de las Indias, written in the early 1600s using Columbus's original log. Disaster struck on Christmas Day, 1492, when the Santa Maria ran aground on a coral reef off the northern coast of Hispaniola. The flagship was a total loss, but the indigenous people helped salvage the cargo and supplies. Guacanagari's generosity in this crisis impressed Columbus, who saw an opportunity to establish Spain's first settlement in the New World. Using timber from the wrecked Santa Maria, Columbus's men constructed a small fort they called La Navidad, Nativity. 39 volunteers agreed to remain behind while Columbus returned to Spain with news of his discoveries. These men, left with supplies to last a year, were instructed to search for gold mines and establish peaceful relations with the natives. Columbus's decision to leave these men represented a crucial turning point. What began as a voyage of discovery was transforming into a colonial enterprise. The admiral distributed European goods among the local caciques, established rudimentary trading relationships, and began collecting specimens and artifacts to present to the Spanish court. As he prepared for the return journey aboard the tiny Niga, Columbus remained convinced that he had reached the Indies. His journal entries from this period reflect a man torn between honest reporting and the need to justify his expensive expedition. He wrote extensively about the potential for converting the natives to Christianity and the possibilities for future trade, while downplaying the absence of the great cities and spice markets he had promised to find. The return voyage of Christopher Columbus tested his seamanship as severely as his outbound journey had challenged his faith. Departing Hispaniola on January 16, 1493, aboard the small caravel Niga, Columbus carried with him 7 captured Taino people, exotic birds, unusual plants, small quantities of gold, and most importantly, the news that would revolutionize European understanding of the world. The Niga had been designed for coastal trading, not ocean crossing, and Columbus faced the daunting prospect of navigating 3,000 miles of winter Atlantic with a crew of only 22 men. Worse yet, he had been reunited with Martin Alonso Pinzon and the Pinta, but tensions between the two captains remained high. Following Pinzon's unauthorized departure months earlier, for 3 weeks, the voyage proceeded smoothly as the two ships sailed northeast, riding favorable trade winds. Columbus used this time to compile his reports for the Spanish monarchs, carefully crafting his account to emphasize the potential wealth and strategic importance of his discoveries, while minimizing the challenges and setbacks he had encountered. The peaceful journey ended abruptly in mid-February, when the ships encountered a massive storm off the Azores. For 3 days and nights, hurricane-force winds and towering waves threatened to send both vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic. Columbus later wrote that he feared his discoveries would die with him, and he sealed copies of his reports in barrels, hoping they might somehow reach Spain even if his ships did not. When the storm finally subsided, Columbus found himself alone. The Pinta had vanished in the tempest. Unknown to him, Pinzon's ship had survived and was limping toward the Spanish coast by a different route. The Niga, badly damaged and taking on water, managed to reach the Portuguese island of Santa Maria in the Azores on February 18, 1493. The Portuguese authorities initially detained Columbus and his men, suspecting they had been trading illegally in Portuguese waters off Africa. This diplomatic incident nearly derailed Columbus's triumphant return, as King John II of Portugal had every right to be suspicious of Spanish activities in regions he claimed as Portuguese territory. After tense negotiations, Columbus was released and allowed to continue his journey. The Niga reached Lisbon on March 4, 1493, where Columbus was granted an audience with King John II, the same monarch who had rejected his westward voyage proposal nearly a decade earlier. The irony was not lost on either man as Columbus displayed his captured natives and described the lands he had claimed for Spain. The details of Columbus's reception in Lisbon are documented in João de Barros's Decades da Asia, providing Portuguese perspective on these events. King John II listened carefully to Columbus's account, immediately recognizing the enormous implications of the Spanish discovery. The Portuguese monarch privately regretted his earlier decision to reject Columbus's proposal, realizing that Spain had potentially gained access to vast new territories and resources that could shift the balance of European power. Columbus finally reached the Spanish port of Palos on March 15, 1493, exactly 7 months and 12 days after his departure. Remarkably, Martin Alonso Pinzon arrived in the Pinta on the same day. Having survived the February storm and made his own way back to Spain, however, Pinzon was gravely ill and died within days of his return, taking with him any potential challenge to Columbus's version of events. The admiral of the ocean sea's reception in Spain exceeded his wildest dreams. Word of his return spread rapidly throughout the kingdom, and crowds gathered wherever he traveled. The 6 surviving Taino captives, dressed in European clothes and carrying exotic parrots and gold ornaments, provided living proof of Columbus's achievements. Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II received Columbus at the court of Barcelona in April 1493 with unprecedented ceremony. The explorer was granted the privilege of sitting in the royal presence, an honor normally reserved for the highest nobility. As Columbus recounted his voyages and displayed his specimens, the monarchs immediately began planning a second, much larger expedition to consolidate Spanish claims to these new territories. The success of Columbus's first voyage transformed him from an obscure foreign navigator into one of the most famous men in Europe. His achievement had proven that the ocean sea could be crossed, that habitable lands lay beyond the western horizon, and that Spain now possessed territories that could rival the wealth of the Indies. The euphoria surrounding Christopher Columbus's triumphant return to Spain quickly transformed into urgent preparations for a much more ambitious enterprise. Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II, recognizing the enormous potential of their admiral's discoveries, authorized a second voyage that would dwarf the first expedition in both scale and purpose. This time, Columbus would sail not merely as an explorer, but as the appointed viceroy and governor of Spain's new overseas territories. On September 25, 1493, Columbus departed Cadiz with a fleet of 17 ships, carrying over 1,200 men. Unlike the desperate venture of 1491, this expedition resembled a floating city, complete with soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, priests, and government officials. The Spanish crown had invested heavily in this colonial enterprise, providing everything needed to establish permanent settlements in the New World. The fleet followed a more southerly route than the first voyage, reaching the Lesser Antilles. After only 21 days at sea, Columbus named the first island he encountered Dominica, in honor of the Sunday on which it was sighted. As the fleet worked its way through the Caribbean chain, the Spanish encountered their first evidence of the darker realities of indigenous life in these islands. On the island Columbus named Guadalupe, his men discovered the remnants of a Carib settlement that told a horrifying story. Human bones, some still bearing teeth marks, provided gruesome evidence of cannibalistic practices among some of the native peoples. This discovery shattered Columbus's earlier romantic descriptions of the innocent, peaceful natives and provided Spanish colonists with their first justification for more aggressive policies toward indigenous populations. The expedition's priorities became clear when Columbus reached Hispaniola in late November 1493. The admiral's first concern was checking on the 39 men he had left at La Navidad settlement. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The fort had been destroyed, and all 39 Spaniards were dead. Guacanagari, the cacique who had welcomed Columbus so warmly during the first voyage, provided a devastating account of what had transpired. The Spanish settlers, rather than searching for gold mines and establishing peaceful trade relationships, had instead abused their position, demanding excessive tribute from the natives and seizing Taino women. When several caciques finally rebelled against these abuses, the isolated and outnumbered Spaniards were overwhelmed and killed. These events are detailed in Michel d'Acunio's letter to Hieronimo Anari, providing an eyewitness account of the second voyage's discoveries. It challenges Columbus faced a crisis that would define his approach to colonial governance. Rather than acknowledging the errors that had led to the La Navidad massacre, he chose to interpret the deaths as treachery by ungrateful natives who had turned against their Spanish benefactors. This decision set the tone for increasingly harsh policies toward indigenous peoples. Throughout Spain's growing American empire, the admiral established a new settlement called La Isabela on the northern coast of Hispaniola, but the colony struggled from its inception. Many of the Spanish colonists had joined the expedition expecting to find ready-made cities filled with gold and spices. Instead, they found themselves clearing tropical forests, building houses, and planting crops while battling disease, hunger, and increasingly hostile relations with native peoples. Columbus implemented a tribute system that required every Taino adult to deliver a specified quantity of gold dust to Spanish authorities. Every 3 months, those who failed to meet their quotas faced severe punishment, including mutilation or enslavement. This policy transformed the indigenous population from potential trading partners into forced laborers, fundamentally altering the nature of European-American relations. The admiral also authorized slave raids against Carib populations, justifying these actions by claiming that cannibals had forfeited their rights to freedom. Ships loaded with captured natives were sent back to Spain, where they were sold in slave markets. However, Queen Isabella I, troubled by reports of these practices, eventually ordered that indigenous peoples be treated as subjects of the Spanish crown rather than as chattel. By 1495, Columbus faced mounting criticism from colonists who accused him of mismanagement and broken promises. Many Spaniards returned to Europe with complaints about the admiral's authoritarian rule and the harsh conditions in Hispaniola. These reports reached the Spanish court, where officials began questioning whether Columbus possessed the administrative skills necessary to govern Spain's new territories effectively. The second voyage revealed the fundamental contradictions in Columbus's colonial vision. His romantic notion of converting peaceful natives to Christianity while establishing profitable trade relationships proved incompatible with the Spanish colonists' hunger for immediate wealth and the indigenous people's determination to maintain their traditional ways of life. Christopher Columbus's third voyage to the New World began under a cloud of controversy that would shadow the remainder of his career. Reports from disgruntled colonists had reached the Spanish court, painting the admiral as an incompetent administrator who had failed to deliver the promised wealth, while alienating both Spanish settlers and indigenous populations. Nevertheless, Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II authorized another expedition, though with significantly reduced resources and much closer royal oversight. Departing Seville on May 30th, 1498, Columbus commanded a fleet of only 6 ships carrying approximately 200 men. The Spanish monarchs had divided the expedition's mission. 3 ships were to sail directly to Hispaniola with supplies for the struggling colony, while Columbus would take the remaining vessels on a more southerly route to explore new territories. This new course led Columbus to his most significant geographical discovery. On July 31st, 1498, his lookout spotted 3 mountain peaks rising from the sea, which the admiral named Trinidad in honor of the Holy Trinity. As his ships approached this large island, Columbus noticed something that filled him with excitement. The water around Trinidad was fresh, not salt, indicating the presence of a massive river system nearby. On August 1st, 1498, Columbus became the first European to sight the South American mainland when he observed the low coastline of what is now Venezuela. The enormous volume of fresh water flowing from the Orinoco River convinced the admiral that he had discovered something unprecedented. In his letters to the Spanish monarchs, Columbus speculated that this great river might flow from the earthly paradise itself, the Garden of Eden described in biblical accounts. The discovery of the South American coast represented Columbus's greatest achievement as an explorer, yet he failed to grasp its full significance. Still convinced that he was exploring islands off the coast of Asia, Columbus did not realize that he had found an entirely new continent. This mainland would eventually prove far more valuable than all the Caribbean islands combined, containing vast mineral wealth and supporting enormous indigenous populations. Columbus's exploration of the Venezuelan coast revealed indigenous societies unlike any he had previously encountered. The native peoples of this region possessed more sophisticated metallurgy, creating intricate golden ornaments and tools that surpassed anything found in the Caribbean islands. However, Columbus had little time to establish relationships with these mainland peoples, as urgent reports from Hispaniola demanded his immediate attention. Columbus's account of discovering the South American mainland is preserved in his letter to the Spanish monarchs, dated October 18, 1498, when Columbus finally reached Santo Domingo, the new capital of Hispaniola. In late August 1498, he found the colony in complete chaos. Spanish colonists had divided into rival factions, each claiming legitimate authority over the settlement. Francisco Roldán, the Chief Justice Columbus had appointed, was leading a rebellion against the admiral's brothers Diego and Bartholomew Columbus, who had been left in charge during the admiral's absence. The rebels accused the Columbus family of tyrannical rule, claiming they had been denied their rightful shares of gold and native slaves. Roldan's followers had established their own settlements and were living among Taino communities, taking indigenous women as wives and demanding tribute from local caciques. The situation had deteriorated so badly that Spanish colonists were fighting each other, while indigenous peoples watched their conquerors tear themselves apart. Columbus attempted to restore order through a series of compromises that satisfied no one. He granted land and native slaves to Roldan's followers, officially legitimizing the encomienda system that would dominate Spanish colonial policy for centuries. Under this arrangement, Spanish colonists received grants of indigenous laborers who were theoretically free, but in practice worked as slaves on plantations and in mines. These concessions temporarily ended the rebellion but created new problems. For Columbus's administration, the encomienda system accelerated the destruction of indigenous societies, while establishing patterns of exploitation that would characterize European colonialism. Throughout the Americas, the admiral, desperate to maintain control, had essentially sanctioned the enslavement of the very peoples he had once praised as potential Christians and trading partners. Reports of continuing unrest in Hispaniola finally prompted Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand to take direct action. In 1500, they appointed Francisco de Bobadilla as royal commissioner, with authority to investigate conditions in the colony and restore order. When Bobadilla arrived in Santo Domingo, he found Spanish rebels hanging from gallows and evidence of widespread abuse of indigenous peoples. Bobadilla immediately arrested Columbus and his brothers, loading them aboard a ship bound for Spain, in chains. The sight of the admiral of the ocean sea being transported as a prisoner shocked observers. Throughout the Spanish Empire, Columbus had risen from obscure navigator to colonial governor, only to fall victim to the very conflicts his policies had created. The third voyage marked the beginning of the end for Columbus's colonial career, but it also represented his greatest contribution to geographical knowledge. His discovery of South America opened an entire continent to European exploration and colonization, though the admiral himself never fully understood the magnitude of his achievement. The chains that bound Christopher Columbus during his humiliating return to Spain in 1500 symbolized the dramatic reversal of fortune that had transformed the admiral of the ocean sea from celebrated hero to disgraced colonial administrator. Yet even as he faced royal interrogation and public disgrace, Columbus's unshakable conviction that he had discovered a westward route to the Indies continued to drive him toward one final attempt to vindicate his geographical theories. Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II, while disappointed by Columbus's failures as a governor, still recognized his value as an explorer. After reviewing Francisco de Bobadilla's reports from Hispaniola, the monarchs chose to restore Columbus's personal freedom while permanently stripping him of his administrative powers over the colonies he had founded. The admiral would be allowed one more voyage, but this time he would sail purely as an explorer, forbidden from landing in Hispaniola or interfering with the new colonial government. On May 11, 1502, Columbus departed Cadiz on his fourth and final voyage to the New World. His fleet consisted of 4 small ships carrying 150 men, including his 13-year-old son Ferdinand, who would later write a biography of his father's adventures at 51 years old. Columbus was showing signs of the arthritis and other ailments that would plague his remaining years, but his determination to find a westward passage to the Indies remained as strong as ever. This final expedition would prove to be Columbus's most challenging and ultimately most tragic. After a brief stop in the Canary Islands, the fleet sailed directly to the Caribbean, reaching Martinique on June 15, 1502. Despite explicit royal orders to avoid Hispaniola, Columbus decided to seek shelter at Santo Domingo, claiming that one of his ships needed urgent repairs. Nicolas de Ovando, the new governor of Hispaniola, refused to allow Columbus to enter the harbor. Following the precise instructions he had received from Spain, the admiral was forced to seek shelter elsewhere as a massive hurricane approached the Caribbean. Ironically, Columbus's experience reading weather signs allowed him to save his own fleet while the hurricane destroyed a treasure convoy that had just departed Santo Domingo, including the ship carrying his nemesis Francisco de Bobadilla back To Spain. Columbus continued westward from Hispaniola, becoming the first European to explore the Caribbean coast of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. This region, which he called Veragua, contained the richest gold deposits he had yet encountered, and Columbus became convinced that he had finally reached the approaches to the legendary wealth of the Indies. The events of the fourth voyage are documented in Columbus's letter to the Spanish monarchs, known as the Letter of Rarissima, dated July 7, 1503. The expedition established a temporary settlement called Santa Maria de Belen at the mouth of the Belen River in Panama. But hostile indigenous peoples forced the Spanish to abandon this outpost after several months. The local Guaymi people, unlike the Taino of the Caribbean islands, possessed sophisticated military organization and proved capable of sustained resistance against European encroachment. Disaster struck the expedition when shipworms destroyed two of Columbus's vessels, forcing him to beach the remaining ships on the coast of Jamaica in June 1503. For more than a year, Columbus and his men remained stranded on the island, dependent on indigenous peoples for food, while the admiral sent messages to Hispaniola, requesting rescue. The Jamaica experience revealed both Columbus's resourcefulness and his growing desperation when the local Taino people began refusing to provide food. Columbus used his knowledge of astronomy to intimidate them, correctly predicting a lunar eclipse and claiming that his god would darken the moon as punishment for their disobedience. This successful deception secured continued provisions, but further poisoned relations between Europeans and indigenous peoples. Columbus was finally rescued from Jamaica in June 1504 and returned to Spain in November of that year, his health broken and his reputation in ruins. The man who had once been received by monarchs as the equal of nobility now found himself largely ignored by the Spanish court, which was focused on consolidating control over the vast territories his voyages had revealed. The admiral spent his final years petitioning the crown for restoration of his privileges and titles, writing lengthy memorials that mixed geographical observations with increasingly mystical religious interpretations of his discoveries. Columbus died at Valladolid on May 20, 1506, still believing that he had found islands off the coast of Asia rather than entirely new continents. The true magnitude of Columbus's achievement only became clear in the decades following his death. His four voyages had connected the hemispheres that had been separated for millions of years, initiating the most significant cultural and biological exchange in human history. The Columbian Exchange, as historians now call it, transformed agriculture, disease patterns, and human societies on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The indigenous peoples of the Americas paid an enormous price for Columbus's discoveries. European diseases decimated populations that had no immunity to smallpox, measles, and typhus, while colonial policies destroyed traditional societies and enslaved millions of native peoples. The demographic catastrophe that followed Columbus's voyages represents one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Yet Columbus's legacy extends far beyond the immediate consequences of contact between Europe and America. His voyages demonstrated that the world's oceans could be navigated and mapped, inspiring generations of explorers who completed the task of connecting all inhabited continents. Within 50 years of Columbus's death, European navigators had circumnavigated the globe and established trade networks that linked Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas in a truly global economy. The world that emerged from Columbus's voyages bears little resemblance to the one the admiral himself envisioned, but his fundamental achievement proving that the Americas existed and could be reached by sailing west from Europe changed the course of human history forever. Christopher Columbus died believing he had failed to reach the Indies, never realizing that his failure had revealed something far more significant: the existence of an entire new world that would reshape human civilization for centuries to come.